Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel says we Europeans truly have to take our fate into our own hands, adding we have to fight for our own destiny. Well, indeed, Europe is still relatively rich. Why shouldn't it be more self-reliant? Is this the start of a transatlantic divorce? Cross-talking the transatlantic relationship, I'm joined by my guest Mark Ullman in Oxford. He is a modern history lecturer at the University of Oxford. In Stuttgart, we have Ralph Niemeyer. He is a German journalist and author. And in New York, we cross to Gilbert Doctorow. He is the European coordinator of the American Committee for East-West Accord. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Gilbert, if I can go to you first in New York. It's one of those remarkable times where two important world leaders say completely different things, are completely opposed to each other, and I agree with them both at the same time. Europe needs to be more self-reliant, and if NATO is to exist in the way the people in power that want it to exist, they need to pay for it. That means Germans have to pay more, French have to pay more, Poles, everybody else. Everyone should pay if they feel their security is threatened. So remarkably, we have this moment in history where we have two people diametrically opposed to each other, and I agree with both of them at the same time. Your thoughts, my friend Gilbert in New York?
Well, I think the audience is looking for clarification and penetrating analysis and understanding of where we're going. And I'm afraid we'll be disappointed by this show, not because of the failures of any of the participants, but because of the complete opaqueness of the meetings that took place this last week. I mean, both the G7 and the NATO meeting. Very little came out of it. In fact, when you mention at the start Angela Merkel's remarks, that is these are virtually the only tea leaves we have to understand that there was a very serious conflict between Trump and the European allies. What the nature of that conflict was came out in unconvincing, unpersuasive terms, as covered in the New York Times. That it had to do with global warming, that had to do with trade rules, and that it had to do in terms of NATO with their contributions. None of this is sufficient to explain a divorce as such, which from the language of Merkel looked, as you say, where we're headed. So we have a lot of confusion, a lot of opaqueness.
Okay, you know, Ralph, if I go to you in Stuttgart, I mean, is somebody bluffing in this conversation here? I mean, you know, NATO is the pillar of Western security. We've been told that, you know, particularly the last 25 years where it is an alliance looking for a mission, and that mission, I guess, is supposed to defend itself against quote-unquote Russian aggression. Well, do the Europeans want to pay for this? Because a lot of people are saying security against what? What is the risk? And when you make people pay for it, they're going to ask some more penetrating questions and not listen to just propaganda. Go ahead, Ralph in Stuttgart.
Well, Peter, I think it's quite simple. What is happening right now has been overdue for many, many years, if not the last 20 years, because I say when the Iron Curtain came down, it was the moment that the 20th century and the post-war history actually has finished. It has come to a conclusion. Then we had some time where we didn't know what to do with NATO, whether NATO should still exist or not. And first we were offering even to the Russians that they could participate. Then this offer was being withdrawn, and this is where we have a lot of the controversy now. Now, I think, as you said before, there's a window of opportunity here, or a historic moment, kind of, where all the leaders have to reassemble again and regroup and to say what they want. And I find it quite refreshing that Mr. Trump is so honest in this. I disagree with many things he says, and I don't like him. I'm a more left-leaning politician or writer, author, whatever you call me. But I disagree with many of his policies, but I do agree that we have to upset the apple cart a bit in order to reshift things.
Okay, Mark, it's really interesting is that when Merkel used the pronoun we. She meant we Europeans. One of the interesting things that the Western media doesn't really talk about very much, that is, you know, if you can continue to try to keep the Russians at bay, you know, keep the Russians out, okay, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down, this is kind of a defining moment, because is this what Angela Merkel is talking about? Because, you know, if you look at the situation with Russia, and Mr. Trump may be signaling that he's lost interest, then you have a German-centric Germany. Is that something NATO allies have actually thought about? Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think that's always been a problem. Yes, that whether we talk about NATO or we talk about the EU, one of the reasons why other countries like the Dutch or the Danes or whoever wanted the British in was in order to balance any preponderance of German power, including economic power. For a long time, the Germans under Kohl, and even it seemed at first under Angela Merkel, were basically saying, we don't want to be the leader, we don't want to be the driver of Europe, because we are slightly afraid of what that means. Will our national demons come unstuck and come out into the open again? And now, with her own election coming up in September, she's playing the nationalist card. Maybe she will drop this card once re-elected. But, of course, the situation is changing, as your two other contributors have said, and particularly Donald Trump has thrown down the gauntlet on why do the rich Europeans pay so little for the NATO alliance. And of course the big question now is, even though they do pay relatively little compared with the States, if we take all the European NATO countries together, they have much more conventional military power than Russia. So if Russia might, in a sense, theoretically pose a threat to a weak neighbour, say Ukraine, it can't really pose a threat to the European NATO allies, because taken together, they greatly outnumber the Russian armed forces.
Well, okay.
Remember, 30 years ago, there were 6.
Mark, let's remember here, you mentioned Ukraine. Ukraine isn't part of NATO. That is no one's security responsibility. Exactly. They are a sovereign, independent country here. Exactly. I know Washington and other forces want them in NATO just to be against Russia, but, you know, this is one of the very interesting things. Let me go to Gilbert here. I mean, if the United States is going to start some kind of amicable divorce here, doesn't that really, is it incumbent upon the Europeans, because we have to keep in mind Brexit, for the Europeans to reassess their relationship with Russia? I mean, because if the United States isn't going to be in the picture, if the UK isn't going to be in the picture, maybe this would be a good thing. Maybe this would be a fresh start to talk. Go ahead, Gilbert.
Well, the first thing that we have to understand, and I was getting at in my opening remarks, is we don't really know who is running foreign policy in Washington today. Because of the global assault on the Trump administration and the Russiagate campaigners, the administration has gone into double talk, and from one side of the mouth they're saying everything that the hardliners want to hear about the U.S. policy towards Russia and how we're going to step up sanctions and so forth. And for the other side of the mouth, they're speaking to the audience that would like better relations with Russia, and their feet are pointed in the direction of better relations, as we saw from the outcome of the meeting with Lavrov and Kislyak in Donald's office. A week ago or 2 weeks ago, I would have said that Henry Kissinger is steering Donald, and that was an answer to the remarks that you hear generally that Donald is rattling around in the White House and doesn't have a clue as to what's going on. No, he definitely had a clue, and he wasn't rattling around by himself. We all saw at the meeting with Lavrov that Henry Kissinger was by his side, and the policies that were being put in effect immediately preceding that had the fingerprints of Henry Kissinger all over them. I mean, precisely the attack on Syria, precisely the threat of attack on North Korea. This was realpolitik in action. It was buying time for Donald for the two-week window that he used to overturn in the House the Obamacare legislation, and that was Kissinger. But what's happened now in this last weekend is certainly not Kissinger. Kissinger has been from the very beginning, going back to the 60s and straight through his time and testifying about Russia policy in the 1990s, when the question of Russia admission to NATO was on the agenda. Kissinger has always been in favor of a strong NATO. So the notion of a NATO that is no longer the driving force of U.S. foreign policy, but a much more modest NATO, if a NATO at all, that is not Henry Kissinger. So who exactly is writing our policy?
You know, Ralph, you know, let's speak to different directions here, because, you know, Germany is the most important country in Europe, and just because of its sheer economic size here. I mean, But because of the politics of austerity in the EU, how do the leaders of the EU going to talk to voters and say, we need to spend more money on defense? Is that going to go down very well, particularly if the United States says, you know, if you're not going to pay your way, why should the American taxpayer be burdened so much? Okay, of course, the NATO bureaucracy wants to survive and thrive, the arms dealers and all that. But what about the average European? What does NATO mean to them? Go ahead.
Well, I think here in Germany the population does not understand why we should have to pay more for NATO. And NATO itself lost a lot of its credibility over the last years. And as I said before, it's probably really obsolete. And Mr. Trump was right. We don't need it. We need a new security system, including Russia, and have it, let's say, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and agree on things and make it peaceful. So on the other hand, people here, and especially in an election year, they do not understand this talk that we have to spend more for arms. And secondly, we have to say the American presence in our territory by having Ramstein Air Base, using it for the drone war in Afghanistan and Syria and all that. You know, this doesn't go down well with any voters, and I tell you, at least 80% of Germans are opposing that, even though they are not voting leftist, but they would like to hear Mrs. Merkel say it even clearer and not try to install a German dominance over Europe or over, in this situation, or over NATO. We don't need that, and I don't think that the Germans want that. They want to have a peaceful relationship with Russia and other partners.
Hang on, gentlemen, I have to go to a hard break here, and after that short break we'll continue our discussion on what's next for Europe. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lobel. To remind you, we're discussing what's next for Europe. Okay, Mark, let me go back to you in Oxford. Let me read you something that James Mattis, the Defense Secretary of the United States, said in American media regarding Russia and NATO. Quote, right now, Russia's future should be wedded to Europe. Why they see NATO as a threat is beyond me. Clearly, NATO is not a threat. He went on to say, but the bottom line is NATO is not a threat, and they, the Russians, know it. They have no doubt about this. That is a complete misreading of how Russia sees NATO. It does see NATO as a threat. Any military alliance of that size, particularly with the United States as a member, would threaten anyone's borders. And we have to point out to our viewers here, NATO has doubled in size since the end of the Cold War, membership-wise, doubled. Okay, in an alliance that was created to fend off a Soviet attack, okay? Speak to the American perception of the Russian perception of NATO. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, there's a huge problem, isn't there? If you follow Senate and House Intelligence and Foreign Affairs Committees meetings, Russia is repeatedly referred to as an enemy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if General Mattis may not be himself hostile to Russia, although he has said rather harsh things about Russia in the past, but the whole mood of Washington is not simply to regard Russia as not an ally, not even as a rival, but as an enemy state. And an enemy is something you fight. And we know the American military doctrine from Ulysses S. Grant onwards has been you annihilate the enemy, as also General Mattis has said he wants to do to IS terrorists. So if you bring an enormous military power very close to St. Petersburg, a few minutes away, only 400 miles away or so from Moscow, closer to Moscow than the border was before Peter the Great, then it's understandable that Russians who have a long experience of being invaded from the West don't necessarily take the strange forked tongue approach of the Americans and some of their allies too seriously. One hand they're told, what have you got to be afraid of? On the other hand, they're told they're the enemy. And I think also, this, coming to the wider point that we've been touching on, raises the question, who is the enemy? Actually, Russians, like Germans, like the French, like the British in the last week, have faced a terrorist threat. The real everyday threat to ordinary people is being blown up on a bus or going to a concert. It's actually not the Third World War fought between the Red Army and NATO. And yet, so much of our rhetoric and our military planning and our, if you like, propaganda is orientated towards this threat from the East, whereas in practice, to the great majority of people, their risk, although thankfully a small one, but still the real risk, is being attacked by a jihadi terrorist.
You know, Gilbert, speak to that, because it seems like the powers that be in Brussels and in Washington they're just in a time warp. I mean, let's examine what Mark just said right there. I mean, it's a common occurrence now to have terrorist attacks in Europe. It's common. And we're still told that the enemy is Russia. I mean, and plus, let's look at the Baltic republics. Russia might invade Estonia. I've been to all of the Baltic republics. There's nothing there that Russia wants. As a matter of fact, if you look at the demographics of those three countries, young people are leaving in droves because there's nothing to do. There's no work. I mean, I've lived in Russia for like 19 years. I don't see why anyone thinks that Russia wants to attack any of its neighbors or rule over any people that do not want to be ruled over. Go ahead, Gilbert.
Peter, I'd like to be very careful about our language. The use of the word enemy is entirely inappropriate.
Sure.
It doesn't describe the real relations between the countries. At the same time, to soft pedal this and to present Russia as a fuzzy, friendly bear is to do ourselves and the world peace a disservice. When people say that Russia is the greatest security threat to the United States, I subscribe to that, and I wish that my countrymen also understood that. Because if they did understand that, they would realize why you, me, and others on this show are the true, genuine patriots for the United States and for world peace generally. My point is that Russia is the only country on earth that can incinerate the United States. It's terrible for people not to appreciate that with the risks that we are all incurring by this very careless behavior towards Russia, backhanded relation towards Russia, and by calling out all the wrong sides of our competition. And we do have a competition, and competitions aren't necessarily unhealthy. On the contrary, but we should not have a confrontation, and we should not place ourselves in harm's way, not our armed forces, but the whole nation is in harm's way, when we don't face the facts about the vital strategic even balance between the United States and Russia. I was just doing my market research. As your viewers will know, they never have seen me in New York appear on this show. And I came to the States for a college reunion. I came for a college reunion that with 900 very, very mature, very experienced, very successful people in all branches of life who are civic-minded and individually very nice people and very well-meaning people.
Okay, all right.
Not one of them.
Gilbert, tell everybody, no, this is important. Gilbert, you're a Harvard alumnus, okay? You didn't say the institution here. Go ahead, finish up your point. Go ahead, real quick.
My point was I was delighted to see that on one-to-ones with my colleagues, they didn't have a clue about the nature of the Russian military posture, about the dangers that we're incurring, which go back to the kind of standoff we had before the Cuban Missile Crisis. They didn't have a clue. And I really wish that our team would be more successful and penetrate better the general audience of educated people who just are clueless as to the risks that we're all
I agree here. Let me go to Ralph here in Stuttgart. I mean, as a European, a continental European, is it genuinely believed that NATO, its greatest adversary is Russia? I mean, tell me about, because I've told that the German press is extremely poisonous when it comes to talking about Russia and the EU's and NATO's relationship with Russia. Do people buy it? Go ahead.
Well, the people do not buy it one-on-one, what is said in the media, because the media is asked many questions. During the Ukraine crisis, for instance, people sensed, and it was not only a few thousand people who sensed it, it was really millions of people who sensed that the media was withholding information or trying to portray Russia in a negative way and have the Kiev government be portrayed in a more neutral or better way. And later people found out that exactly there were fascists around, and they saw these images, and later even ZDF, the main second TV channel here, had to apologize, and because they understood that they went too far in their propaganda against Russia, and now people are very wary of it. We have this term Lügenpresse, which means a press or media of lies, which is a very negative term and was used by the Nazis, so I would never use that. But I think the media in Germany has a lot of credibility lost as well. They have to work hard on it to be more neutral again.
Mark, what is the credibility that NATO has, okay? Because I see a lot of its soft power. There's like NATO TV, and now they want to have some kind of propaganda program to educate young people about it. What is the credibility that NATO has, do you think, with the populations of member countries? Because if I'm not mistaken, it was like 2 summers ago, there was a very international questionnaire, public opinion, about how they felt about the security of other member countries, and a lot of like the Italians and the French really didn't particularly care much about the Slovaks, and the Brits didn't really care much about Estonia, and that was something that was very worrying for the NATO elite. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think that's it. You see, in a sense, we could say that NATO is divided into old and new Europe. The East European states, and particularly their political leaders and their media class, we don't necessarily know what the ordinary people think, and perhaps people there are used to feeling they ought to say whatever the official television says, is anti-Russian. And there's some sense it's a historical anti-Russianness in Poland, but also residue of the communist period. But as you say, further west and south in Europe, people don't necessarily feel the threat that they're supposed to feel from Russia, because apart from that, it's a long way away, and it's very difficult to imagine. And this is why NATO is, in a sense, an organisation that has enormous power and influence, but is not really known to many people, particularly as we no longer have military conscription. Fewer and fewer ordinary people have been involved in the military. But that also has the downside that we can have NATO policies of intervening in Libya, in Syria, and around the world, even now building a kind of NATO-Arab alliance, because you have a professional mercenary military rather than a citizen military. And this means that you can carry through policies that don't really affect the bulk of the population, in the sense that the body bags are seen to be professionals, they've taken the chance, that's their chance. Of course, it can then have huge blowback, as we've seen from Libya. But I think this is the big danger, that military policy and democracy are being separated.
A very good point. Go ahead, jump in. Go ahead.
Peter, on the question...
Go ahead.
On the question of NATO, I'm not a fan of NATO, and any of my readers or followers would know that quite well. At the same time, I think it has to be frankly admitted that if you take NATO out of the equation today, Europe is defenseless. The component that would be taken out at once is Britain. Britain is leaving the EU. Britain was never a subscriber to the notion of a European army. This was always held, that is, David Cameron's feet were always held to the fire on that very issue, that Britain in no way would subscribe to a European European army.
What enemy does the European Union have? What enemy do NATO members have, other than terrorism, from what I can see? What other enemy do they have?
This was the very issue that was brought out about a little over a year ago in a Center for European Policy Studies a brochure on the creation of a European army, which followed closely upon exactly Angela Merkel's statement then in favor of such an army. The fact that she has come out over this weekend talking about Europe looking to its own, that is a continuation and perhaps a more precise explanation of what she had said more cryptically before in favor of a European army. But a European army will reflect the very differing conceptions of threats to Europe, depending on where you are geographically. Southern Europe and France and Italy and Spain, they look to North Africa as the greatest threat to their well-being and their safety, whereas Central Europe and Eastern Europe look to Russia. Now, the issue is not how justified these views are, but you have to acknowledge these are the issues. They also mean that the various European states which have very large budgets and which together several times exceed Russia are not equipped at present to act in a unified way against either one of those threats from the south or from the east. And so it would take an enormous effort now to constitute a European army.
On that note, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. Again, we don't know what direction NATO is going to take or the relationship between Europe and the United States and Russia. Many thanks to my guests in New York, Stuttgart, and in Oxford. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I see.